Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming or coming back. Welcome to the Department of Design Research, Writing, and Criticism. I'm Molly Heinz, the co-chair. Thank you, along with our co-chair Alice Twimlow, who is currently based in Amsterdam. As I always like to say, here with us in spirit, if not in body. So I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of our fall lecture series, which we are plowing through. We're already at November 17th, and we have a few more left in December. And if you weren't here last Tuesday, we actually had a couple of events happening. We relaunched our Brown Bag Lunch series, and we had Frontier Design In, which is a Toronto-based design firm that also has an editorial focus, and they came to preview the magazine that they just launched earlier this week, also called Frontier. And they do a lot of research and use the magazine platform to present that and explore ideas. And then that evening, we had our annual open house, and we invited back a lot of alumni, and we had faculty and some current students presenting. Here's our alum, Brittany Dickinson. She talked a little bit about her thesis project, which led to her actually getting a job teaching sustainability and fashion design at Parsons this year. And if you weren't here but want to see what went down, you can go to our website where the Vimeo video is posted of the whole event. And I'd like to do a quick snapshot of the program, which consists currently of 1 year, that is an academic year, 9 months, 2 semesters. We are currently offering some significant scholarships, which bring the cost down quite a bit. We don't just sit here studying, we actually go out in the field and do a lot of site and studio visits, but we also do bring in a lot of great guest lecturers every week. And we are doing lots of assignments all the time, including the big kahuna, the thesis project, which even though it's a 1-year program, we ask students to write a thesis. And always reading. Here's a quick snapshot of our faculty, and you can read more about them on the website. And another quick look at some of the assignments that we ask our students to engage in and the skills that they develop, from writing news stories to op-eds to podcasts to developing a critical position on a topic to understanding how to engage in an effective interview. And applying is pretty streamlined and simple. Transcripts, a letter of recommendation, a written statement of intent, some writing samples, and your resume. And we have a rolling application system, but we give priority to those we receive by January 15th. And you can find out more about this and the program on our website, which changes every day. And after the speaker presents, we'll have a short Q&A, and then we'll convene over in the studio for drinks and more conversation, so I hope you'll join us afterwards. And we are very happy that our speaker this evening is Brooke Hodge, who is the Deputy Director of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. And Brooke is coming to the museum from the Los Angeles, I'm going to back up. She is coming from the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and she was Director of Exhibitions and Publications at the Hammer since 2010. And when she arrived at the Cooper Hewitt, she also brought with her lots of great things. She coincided with the reopening of the museum, which she might talk a little bit more about. And she also was the curator of Provocations, the architecture and design of Heatherwick Studio, which she originated at the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas. And that's here through January 3rd, and I wholeheartedly encourage you to go see it. It's a fantastic show. So prior to the Hammer Museum, Brooke was Curator of Architecture and Design at MOCA in Los Angeles. And there she organized some major exhibitions on the work of Frank Gehry and car designer Jay Mays, as well as Skin and Bones, Parallel Practices in Fashion and Architecture, an exhibit that examined the relationship between contemporary fashion and architecture. And then before that, unbeknownst to either of us, in the late 90s, Brooke and I actually happened to work across the street from each other in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she was from 1991 to 2001 Director of Exhibitions and Publications at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. And she also held the positions of Adjunct Curator of Architecture at the Fogg Museum and Assistant Dean of Arts at the Graduate School of Design. So I did not know Brooke at the time, but I did know her work. At Harvard, she organized some really, really amazing exhibitions of the work of architects and designers, including Gio Ponti, Zaha Hadid, theater designer and artist Robert Wilson, as well as one on fashion designer Ray Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons, which made a really huge impression on me, and I think you'll be seeing a little bit about that tonight. So even if you haven't been up to the Heatherwick show, it's likely that you've seen Brooke's work as well in the form of words on the page. From 2008 to 2015, she contributed the biweekly column Seeing Things to the New York Times T Magazine blog, and she has also been a contributor to Wallpaper in the LA Times. So I am thrilled that our worlds have the opportunity to overlap again this evening, so please join me in welcoming Brooke Hodge.
Thanks, Molly, for that really nice welcome, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I'm going to give you a kind of behind-the-scenes sort of backstory look at organizing exhibitions, and specifically exhibitions related to architecture, which has always been something that I'm interested in. I have a master's degree in architectural history, and pretty much straight from grad school, I took a job at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, where our first exhibition was all about showing pieces from the collection, which spanned many years from the Renaissance to the present. And at that time, the present was 1989. And the exhibition was all about architectural representation. And so that's what really started me thinking about how one can never show an actual work of architecture in an exhibition. It's always a mediation of it or a representation of it, because unlike painting or sculpture where you can show the real thing, in architecture you always have to sort of tell a story of a building and try to give people a sense of the experience and the materiality and the space and the light of it, but through many other means. And I have to say that after almost 30 years, I guess, of organizing exhibitions about architecture, I think it's still a challenge, and it's still an interesting challenge. And there are some exhibitions where I've seen that challenge met quite successfully. One that comes to mind was an exhibition of Frank Gehry's work in the 80s that Mildred Friedman organized for the Walker Art Center. And in that case, it was because she actually included a full-scale piece, which was one of his fish shapes that was made into a pavilion for the exhibition. And it was like this restaurant that he designed in Barcelona, and that actually gave the experience of one of his forms, at real scale and with real materials, and that was really had a big impact on me. So tonight I'm going to talk about two exhibitions that I organized, and how they came into being, what the challenges were associated with them. And one of them is the Skin and Bones Parallel Practices in Fashion and Architecture exhibition that I organized for the Museum of Contemporary Art in 2006. And that show traveled to Tokyo in 2007, and then to London, where it was shown at the Somerset House in 2008. And it actually has an interesting intersection with the Heatherwick Studio exhibition that I'm also going to talk about. And I thought it would be interesting to try to show the differences involved in organizing a monographic exhibition versus a thematic exhibition with many different designers included in it. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is an installation of Victor and Rolf's Russian doll collection. And this was the opening room in the Skin and Bones show. As Molly mentioned, when I was at Harvard, we had an Excellence in Design Award that we gave to designers in different fields other than those that were represented at the GSD. And the GSD areas of study are landscape architecture, urban design, and architecture. And we thought it was very important for the students to have access to other types of designers. And so we did a project with Philippe Stark, Robert Wilson, Ray Kawakubo, because we wanted the students to understand how other designers work and sort of make those connections, maybe in their own studio work, but also as people or types of designers that they might end up working with after they graduated, so that their world was opened up and they weren't just thinking of maybe, as most architecture students in Boston do, heading to New York and working in a big corporate firm and drawing door schedules for the rest of their careers. So it was a really interesting program, and it was kind of short-lived. And I think the fourth one, which happened after I left, was the car designer Jay Mays, but we put that in motion. So this exhibition was in the spring of 2000, and we were honoring Ray Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons for her contributions to the world of fashion and the world of design. And what was interesting about the exhibition, and we worked very closely with her and with Comme des Garçons on the exhibition. And so she actually designed the exhibition, and some of her staff came and helped us install it. And she, through the course of working on the show, and this was the first exhibition I'd ever done that related to fashion, and this was what sparked my interest and what led to Skin and Bones later on. And what was interesting was to learn that she actually designs or has a very strong hand in designing all of the interiors of her shop. So if you've gone to the Chelsea shop, then you've seen those structures that demarcate the different areas of the retail space. And that's her thinking. And then she has one architect that she works with consistently throughout that actually does the shop drawings and oversees the construction of it, but it's always her vision. So in this case, the idea was to create these structures, and this was right around the time that the Chelsea store had opened and had those Richard Serra-like structures in it. So she designed these structures for our space too. And if you've been at the GSD, the exhibition space is just one long corridor, and it's really ugly, and it's a really hard place to do exhibitions. And over the years that I was doing shows there, I found that if we tried to deny the space, then it didn't really work that well. So in this case, she created these freestanding pavilions that encircled some of the columns that ran down the length of the space. And it's also a space where people are constantly moving through it. They're always moving through it with food and drinks and coffee because the cafe or cafeteria is right next to it. And it's basically has 24-hour access for the students because they're always in the studios working on their projects. So all of those things had to be kept in mind in every show that we did, really, because we couldn't have really valuable objects that could just walk away if they weren't attended to. And there was just one security guard. And there's also a security desk right in the middle of that space that is a fixed desk. It's a square stone desk called the Donut for some unknown reason. And these structures really changed the nature of the space in a kind of simple way. So we covered each of the structures with images that were either images of a collection of Comme des Garçons or of a photograph or a drawing that was inspirational to Ray Kawakubo, and she selected everything. And then inside the pavilions, we had flat screen TVs, and some of them where we showed runway footage of some of the collections, but we didn't show any actual clothes, and people were kind of surprised by that, but it was really interesting, and it actually was more evocative and made people think more about her as a designer than just as a designer of garments, but as a designer of space. And it really changed the nature of that space where people came in the front door and they were disoriented because they didn't see the Donut security desk anymore, and they didn't see any of the columns, and they had to navigate around and through these small pavilions to reach their destination. So it was really interesting, and as I was working on it, we organized a lecture series before it opened about connections between fashion and architecture. And Mark Wigley had edited a book about fashion and architecture, and we invited Val Wark, who had contributed a really nice essay to that book, to speak in that series, as well as Holly Bruback, who had been a writer about fashion for The New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine. And through the course of doing research on Comme des Garçons and then having all of these speakers come to the school, I started to hear all of these connections between the way people would describe the work of Rei Kawakubo and the way one would maybe write about architecture, and using terms like structure, construction, volume. There's always the sense of scale and the body, and in fashion and architecture, everything relates to the body and the person in the enclosure. So that got me started thinking about connections between fashion and architecture, but they hadn't really crystallized that much for me. I was just interested in them. And then I ended up going to Los Angeles to interview for the job at MOCA, and the chief curator asked me, if you get this job, what's your big idea for an exhibition? And I had thought about this fashion and architecture connection, and I thought, I'm really interested in blurring boundaries between disciplines, and this is an art museum, so it's more interesting if I suggest a project that blurs the boundaries between different disciplines. So I sort of naively proposed this project about intersections between fashion and architecture, not really thinking that, this museum's never done anything related to fashion, and fashion can be kind of scary for museums because it's not something they're used to exhibiting, and they think of it as very expensive, and that it involves a lot of other things like mannequins that one doesn't really think of with other types of shows. But they liked the idea. And so as soon as I got there, which was maybe probably about 6 or 9 months after the Comme des Garçons show happened at Harvard, I started to work on this exhibition. And it was, that was in the beginning of 2001, and it opened in 2006. So that gives you a sense of how much time can be involved in putting together an exhibition. And I would say that was a kind of a long time frame. And in that period, I did a number of other exhibitions. So it wasn't the only project that I was working on, but it was the big project. And the other shows were more single-person shows, like the Frank Gehry exhibition or the J. Mays car design exhibition. And so I had to start thinking about the exhibition content and the kinds of themes that I wanted to explore in it, and also who would be in it, and how many designers. And I wanted it to be balanced between fashion designers and architects, and also between established figures and emerging figures. So I did a lot of reading, and I did a lot of talking to people, and I got a subscription to Women's Wear Daily, which just stacked up underneath my desk because it came every day, and I would look through it and get ideas. And so I decided to have about 40 architects. I think in the end, and that's a story that I'll tell you as I go along, there were 39 participants in the exhibition. But they came, I wanted it to be global also, so they came mostly from the US, Japan, and Europe, and Europe being also the UK. So, and I started the exhibition time frame in 1980, because that was right around the time when Comme des Garçons and Yohji Yamamoto were both showing their first really influential shows in Paris when they were deconstructing fashion. And so that was one of the early ideas I had about a parallel between fashion and architecture, was that was happening around the same time, and both fashion designers and architects were literally deconstructing the things that they make as a reaction to reading deconstruction theory and criticism. So that was an interesting parallel. So I started in 1980, and then I fleshed out the time period, and I wanted to include as many new projects as possible. And I have quite a few images to show from the exhibition and of the designer's work, because since it was in 2006, it was quite a long time ago, and not a lot of you will have been able to have seen that show. The other thing that's interesting in doing a big exhibition like this is that there's always a catalog, which is like a book scale thing that goes with the exhibition. And so that, in a way, drives a lot of the thinking about the exhibition, because the schedule for the book is always, you know, if you were just doing an exhibition, you could potentially, although people would get really mad at you inside the museum, add pieces up until the last minute if you had room for them. But with a book, it has to go to the printer, it has to be designed, it has to be edited. So there's like a huge pressure to flesh out all of the ideas and structure them for the book. And so that meant really choosing all of the designers, choosing which collections I was going to show of theirs. And so it wasn't just sort of picking a designer and asking them to choose what they would show, but actually going through a lot of their work in this 25-year period and deciding which pieces to show. And in some cases, I had very close working relationships with people. In other cases, I could just select things and they would say, okay, and they would arrange to have it sent over. So at the beginning, the exhibition, this is another wrinkle that was interesting, is thinking about how a show is going to appear in different spaces. So at the beginning, the exhibition was going to be in the Geffen building at MOCA, which is that giant warehouse space, post-industrial space in Little Tokyo that Frank Gehry, renovated, which meant basically cleaning it up, and there wasn't any climate control or anything, but it was a really vast open space. And so initially I was thinking about the show was going to be in there, and how would I stage it in there, because it's one thing to have an idea and then it's another thing to try to make it visual. So I decided to work with Calvin Sau of Sau and McCown Architects on the exhibition design. And I have to say he was the most incredible colleague, because one of the reasons why I chose him was because not only did he know all about architecture, but he also knew a lot about fashion design. He designed some fashion exhibitions before. He already had a relationship with Ralph Pucci, who's the big mannequin person. So that was the best, probably one of the best collaborations I've ever had with an exhibition designer. And at the Geffen, there's a mezzanine space where you can look out over the big floor of the building. And so there's an opportunity to look at things from above. So that was starting to influence how we were thinking about the exhibition, and creating these kind of islands, almost like a circus, where there would be these different themes happening in different areas, but interconnected in certain ways. Then at a certain point, MOCA decided that it had to make some repairs to the Geffen, and they told me, we're moving the exhibition to the main building on Grand Avenue, which is a building by Isozaki, and it's a much more formal space. And but they said that I could have the whole building, so that was really exciting too, because it was the whole museum. So we had to basically throw out all of our ideas for the exhibition, and rather than having these themes that would kind of coexist in these islands in the space, and people could sort of draw their own connections, we had to use a space that had much more of a defined circulation, so it became much more of a narrative structure to the exhibition, which ultimately I think helped sort of structure how we were going to show things and how ideas would progress within the show. But when the show was going to be at the Geffen, I thought, because the space was so big, it would be really interesting to commission people to either work together in pairs, a fashion designer and an architect, to design an installation, or just a fashion designer to design an installation. And so one of the first people I talked to was Eddie Slimane, who was, I think he was at Saint Laurent then initially, and then he had left, and now he's back there. But what I found out was that some people didn't really want to be in a show with other people, and not specific other people, but just other people in general. So that was a challenge too, was trying to negotiate that terrain. And it became pretty clear, he was very excited about it, but he was like, but I'd like to have my own space. I don't really want to have an installation in a space with Comme des Garçons having an installation, even though I think they're really interesting. So pretty soon I realized that whole installation idea was going to be kind of political, and I abandoned it pretty quickly. And then at the same time I was working on the book. So I had to start thinking about what themes would unite the work of the fashion designers and the architects. And before I picked who was going to be in the show, there were some people that I knew immediately would be in it, like Rei Kawakubo, Yohji Yamamoto, Junya Watanabe, Frank Gehry, Margiela, Rem Koolhaas. and Diller and Scofidio and Renfro. But the other people sort of came, I sort of fleshed it out as I developed the themes for the show, and I started to think about what fashion and architecture have in common. And so these are the main themes of the exhibition: identity, shelter, the body, creative process, geometry, structural skin, constructing volume, deconstruction, and tectonic strategies. And the way that the exhibition unfolded, it started with identity. So the Victor and Rolf installation was a really great, had a lot of visual presence, and we projected the runway show. And in that presentation, they had one model, Maggie Reiser, and they dressed her sequentially in more and more garments until ultimately she had this giant sort of shroud or cape over all of the garments, and they were really heavy, and it was the designers themselves. So it was a performance and a fashion show, and it was all about the idea of going of a life cycle from birth to death, but also from maybe the first dress was like a burlap, very simple sheath, and then the last piece was this kind of opulent embroidered cape. And it also had to do about identity as somebody goes through the stages of life and how their identity might change. For the section on the body, I wanted to feature Azzedine Alaya in that section. So when we were working on the book, we had to ask everybody for images. And I had also gone through, in addition to Women's Wear Daily, there was First View, and at that point I think it was free, and you could just look at any runway show on it, and you could see every garment in the show with a look number. And so it was pretty easy to do a screenshot or tell somebody, I'm really interested in look numbers 35, 36, and 37 from your such and such show. And so I would pick things, or in some cases I would talk to the designer or somebody in their studio and tell them about the themes of the show, and sometimes they would suggest garments. Like Alexander McQueen, I had a few meetings at his studio, not ever with him directly, but with his whole team, and they were really great in going through their archive and picking different projects, different clothes that they thought represented the different themes, and they would send me pictures, and we would sort of go back and forth that way. And it was interesting because the designers that I had more of a connection with, that I developed a longer term relationship with, they ended up having more of a presence in the exhibition because they really embraced the themes and the ideas of the show. And one thing I should say at the beginning, or before I get into it too much, is that the fashion designers were very excited to be in a show with architects. The architects were not so sure about being in a show of fashion designers. And it was interesting because, you know, it was sort of odd to me. I was surprised by that, and it was because but I would say of the architects I asked to be in it, nobody declined. And they all gave me great projects for the show. But a lot of the younger architects were really excited about it, and some of the more established architects were like, I don't get it, you know, fashion's superficial, it's seasonal, it changes. Well, architecture is monolithic and it's permanent, and there's only one of it. In fashion, there's many pieces. So eventually, a lot of them came around and sort of got with the program and the ideas, and some of them we worked with really closely on it. So back to the body. So the second room in the exhibition was going to be devoted to the idea of that all clothes are focused on the body, and Alaya is a designer who's known for really working with the female body. And so when he likes to sort of do everything himself in his studio. So we would contact our person in the studio, and she would say, okay, I must consult with Monsieur Alaya. And then she'd come back and she'd say, okay, Monsieur Alaya is going to the archive, and he's going to pick the images for you, and we will send them to you. And then we'd be calling, well, what about those images? We're coming up on our deadline. And they'd say, oh, Monsieur Alaya is going to the archive tomorrow. And so finally we got some images, and they also sent us a book, and they said, well, you could photograph this picture from the book, which of course isn't going to be great in another book because it's already pixelated to be in the first book. And the images that we got were just not great. So he was at the very beginning of the alphabet, and he had it was so late that we could only save a spread at the beginning. Luckily, it was the beginning, thinking, okay, if he's not in, we can have some other images or something. And so we got the images, we did the spread in the book, and I brought a copy of the book so I can show you after the talk. And we picked the clothes, and they were all ready. And then because the exhibition venue changed, the dates shifted slightly, so it opened later, and the book came out earlier. And the book was in bookstores in Paris, and Monsieur Alaya saw the book and was not happy that he only had 2 pages, where Comme des Garçons had like 6 pages. And actually, to backtrack, when I went, I did meet with him in his studio, and I showed him the floor plan of the space, and I said, oh, and Victor and Rolf are going to be here, and Comme des Garçons is going to be here, and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, well, Victor and Rolf are not going to change fashion history. I don't want to be in the same room with them. So it was all those kinds of things that you don't really know. But you start to realize how somebody sees their place in the world, and how you need to respect that, and how there are different opinions about what's valid and all of that. So he was already sort of, and so I gave him that second room all by himself with like 3 mannequins beautifully lit and everything. So we were waiting for the shipments to start arriving from Paris, and there were like many, many shipments, and showing fashion is a challenge of its own too. And so everything had to be packed really carefully and all of that. And all the French shipments and Spanish shipments were being consolidated and shipped together. So the shipper would call us and say, well, we're still waiting for Monsieur Alaya to like give us the clothes. So the shipment's delayed by a week. And then it kept happening. And soon we were getting to the point where we had to install the exhibition, and we needed those pieces. And then it turned out that Monsieur Alaya had seen the book and wasn't happy about the 2 pages and decided he wasn't going to be in the show. So suddenly at that point, which was probably like a month before it was going to open, or 6 weeks, I think we had a 6-week installation period with like a huge team of people working mostly on the fashion stuff. I had to rethink the whole second room, and I called Ralph Rucci, who was in the exhibition already, and asked him, because his pieces also related really well to the body, if he would lend us additional pieces. And he graciously agreed to do that and track down some private lenders that we could get 3 pieces from. And what was interesting was it made me really nervous, because Alaya is such a big figure. I thought I was going to face a lot of questions about why wasn't Azzedine Alaya in the show, and he's in the book. And nobody ever asked about it, so which I never told him about. So these were the main themes of the show, and then the exhibition progressed through these themes and sort of these kind of large, broader kind of general themes, and then went into more specific, what I call tectonic strategies that both fashion designers and architects would use. And in fashion, it was obviously more of a literal use, and in architecture, it was more of a kind of the appearance of folding, or the appearance of wrapping or draping. So this is just sort of an example of some of the research. So I kept a journal where I clipped things that I was interested in, that especially were visual references that I could go back to. And in some cases, we did borrow those skirts from that Comme des Garçons collection. I actually also got to go to a lot of fashion shows, which was really interesting, and to be able to study the pieces. And then after the fashion shows, especially in Paris, you could go to the showroom and see the pieces in person. So that was really beneficial, and a great way to also meet a lot of the designers. And then I collected a lot of images, both for my own research of fashion shows and of images for the book. And this is the identity section. This was one of the main pieces, which was this amazing Hussein Chalayan installation called Afterwards, where there's a set with furniture, and then these models come out and they take the slip covers off the chairs and they put them on, that you can see over here on the right-hand side, and they're dresses. So the slip covers very easily sort of transform into dresses. And then the last model comes out, and she takes this disc out of the center of the table and she steps into it, and then the table becomes a skirt. And then the chairs fold up into attaché cases, and they walk off the stage and leave an empty room. And this all related to Chalayan's own identity as a Turkish Cypriot who had been grown up on Cyprus and was very aware of all of the strife that existed there between the two cultures. And he was always thinking about what would happen if one had to leave one's home in a hurry, and what would one take with you. And he had a very big presence in the exhibition as well. And this piece had a lot of resonance with people that came to see the show. For the shelters section, I was interested in how both fashion and architecture provide shelter for the body in literal ways, but then also different types of shelter. And in this case, Shigeru Ban had developed this system of refugee housing for the UN High Commissioner for Rwanda in the mid-1990s. And this was a system made of paper tubes and then covered with the blankets that were given to each refugee to make a shelter. And it was a very lightweight, low-cost system and really interesting, and it could just be dropped from a plane or a helicopter to the site. So if there was, say, an earthquake, and he also did a similar system of housing for Kobe after the earthquake there, and if roads were destroyed and you couldn't get in with a truck, then you could fly over and drop these kits, basically, and people could assemble them very easily. And then a parallel to that was Tess Giberson's collection from fall-winter 2003-2004. And at the time, Tess Giberson was a kind of up-and-coming New York-based fashion designer who has took a kind of hiatus from fashion in probably the last 10 years and is now back designing again. But she had created this collection where there was a structure in the center of the room, and all of the models came out and they took off a part of their garment and they draped it onto the structure so that it created this enclosure. And it was very similar in a way to these emergency shelters by Bonn, and it also reinforced this idea of community and doing something together the same way that his project did. To show creative process, Narciso Rodriguez was extremely generous. He spent a lot of time meeting with me about the exhibition. He's somebody who's very interested in architecture, and his clothes may not immediately speak to these connections, but to me they were really interesting because, like somebody like Mies van der Rohe, who uses the structure of a building as the decoration or ornamentation, Rodriguez also uses the structure of a garment, the seams, etc., as the ornament. He doesn't often add any extraneous ornament. And he worked with a photographer, Jackie Marshall, who had worked in his studio before, and she documented him working on collections. And so we had a whole set of these amazing photographs of him really like working on these very small details with his fit models. And it also showed how he worked directly on a model rather than just drawing something and then having somebody else produce it. But he was very involved in the shaping of it, and you can see those lines are actually tape lines where he's marking the seams, and he can make these very fine adjustments. And then there was a section on geometry, and this image is a model by Peter Eisenman that's a Mobius shaped building that was never built for the Max Planck Institute. And then on the right, and I apologize for the bad quality of the photo, is a garment that's designed by Mi-Jin Yoon, who's an architect, who is the dean at MIT Architecture School now. And this was also called the Mobius dress. So she was somebody who I was really interested in because she was really interested in fashion and had explored making fashion using architectural ideas. And there were two architects in the show who were represented by garments, not by buildings. And they're both probably within 10 years of age of each other, and they're kind of like 30s and 40s. And then this is how those skirts from Comme des Garçons, which were all based on geometry and the nature of the pattern, and the model by Peter Eisenman, and then a dress by Yoli Tang appeared in the exhibition. And then this is a dress by Isabel Toledo, where she used a perfect circle for the pattern, and then how the dress transforms when it's on the body. In the structural skin section, we showed this blob wall that Greg Lynn was developing at the time with Panelite, a firm in LA. And so we had the full scale section of the wall, and then we paired it with this Alexander McQueen dress. And we didn't realize at the time that they were going to be so complementary to each other in terms of the color palette. And then we also showed the Seattle Public Library, and we had this really beautiful model from Rem Koolhaas's office, OMA, of the project that shows how the skin and the structure are one and the same. And then there was also a section on Miyake's APOC clothing line. Constructing volume featured different ways that designers would create volume in unusual ways, usually like these clothes in the foreground by Junya Watanabe. that were expanded like origami, and they kind of looked like jellyfish almost because they're very ethereal. And we showed them with a chair by Tokujin Yoshioka that was expanded from, all three of those pieces are honeycomb structures that are flat and then are expanded to create volume. And in some cases, I didn't show architecture in the section because clearly architecture is all about creating volume, so it didn't make sense to show it there, but fashion, it was more unusual to look at it from that vantage point. And then in deconstruction, I always really liked this pairing between the dress by Margiela, where he takes old vintage dresses and takes them apart and puts them together into a new dress, and then Frank Gehry's house, where he took an existing 1920s bungalow in Santa Monica and deconstructed it and kind of reconstructed it using everyday materials. And in the exhibition, we had the model for his house, and then different garments by Vivienne Westwood, Margiela, Junya Watanabe. And one thing that was interesting that it didn't really occur to me at the beginning was that we were going to be showing the actual fashion, so it was life size, but for the architecture, we were showing models. And so in some cases, I felt like the models were diminished, the architecture was diminished, and they looked like toys almost next to a life-size figure. And so if I were going to do it again, I would try to think of some way to create more of a full-scale representation of some of the architecture. And we did that with the Blur building by Diller and Scofidio. And then in the tectonic strategies section, I looked at various strategies like wrapping with Disney Concert Hall and the Comme des Garçons Bump collection, folding in this building by Winka Dubaldam that's here in New York, and a collection from Comme des Garçons. And then pleating, this is a bridge in London by Wilkinson Eyre Architects, and then Miyake's famous pleated clothes, where we also looked at the process of how they were made. And then in printing, there was this beautiful building that was almost completed in Barcelona by Enrique Moraes and Benedetta Tagliabue called Santa Caterina Market. And what was interesting to me was that their drawings for the roof of the building, which was all created by tiles, and it's like a fruit and vegetable market in Barcelona. And so the pattern is these abstracted images of fruit and vegetables created in tile. And the way that Benedetta, made the drawing for the roof was very similar to the way a pattern would appear for a piece of clothing. So even if you think back to that Miyake APOC red image where all the pieces are coming out of one piece of cloth, you can see how, in this case, all of these pieces will fit together ultimately to create this roof. And then Dries van Noten was a key figure in the printing section. In weaving, you can see how early the show was. We included the stadium in Beijing by Herzog and Dimmerant and Ai Weiwei. And so in this case, we had a model and some renderings, but it wasn't completed yet. And then in cantilever, we had to sort of show clothes that created a sense of the idea of cantilever, of something projecting off the body. And then the exhibition closed with a section on synthesis that was really interesting, and it featured Elena Manfredini, who's an architect based in LA, who was making clothes using laser cutting as her tool. She had no training as a fashion designer, but she was really interested in using this tool to create clothes. And then Testa Weiser, who also teach at SciArc, who were really investigating a lot of work using carbon fiber. And so they were actually looking at fashion as an inspiration. And so that was interesting because somebody like Rei Kawakubo could talk a lot about how she looked at architects for inspiration at Le Corbusier or Narcisa Rodriguez would often cite Mies van der Rohe. And in this case, the architects were looking at the fashion designer. And this is a dress by a Japanese designer named Yoshiki Hishinuma, who had been unknown to me until I was working with Testa and Weiser on what they would show. And so I contacted him and included some of his pieces. So that gives you a sense of how some of these discussions that happen during the course of an exhibition can lead to other people being included or other ideas being explored. And then the case of a single designer or one studio's work, I would say is it's less of a challenge than working on a monographic show. With a monographic show, you have to think of how all the themes are going to relate to each other and what the sequence of the exhibition is going to be in the space. itself. In the book, the way the book is organized, it's organized with essays about thematic areas, and then all of the designers are arranged in it alphabetically. But in the case of a single designer, the important question is how to communicate ideas about this person or this studio's work to an audience that may not have seen it. And with Thomas Heatherwick, when I was working on the Skin and Bones show, I was going to London a lot and to meet with designers. And somebody suggested that I should go to visit Thomas Heatherwick. And this is him in his studio from a recent piece in the art edition of Vanity Fair. So it's not when I started doing the show, but where he's at now that he's actually in Vanity Fair. But so in 2002, somebody said, oh, you should go to see this guy, Thomas Heatherwick. He's really interesting, and he's pretty unusual. So I emailed him and asked if I could come and do a studio visit with him. And I was looking for designers for the show at that point for Skin and Bones. And the other thing, just to go back to Skin and Bones, is that having a good exhibition title is really key, and it's really hard. And the book also drives that, if there is a book, so you have to think of a compelling title. So I was always calling Skin and Bones Fashion and Architecture when I would talk about it at the Fashion and Architecture show, but I had to call it something else for the exhibition, and so I did come up with that title, Skin and Bones, which ended up being quite compelling. With Heatherwick, I called the show Provocations, the Architecture and Design of Heatherwick Studio. And in retrospect, because what I discovered when I kind of knew that Thomas Heatherwick wasn't that well known here, but I didn't realize how little known he really is, even in New York, where he has several projects on the boards. I probably would have maybe foregrounded his name more. And Provocations, I think, is an interesting title, but I'm not sure if people really understood what it meant. If they saw it in print or if they saw an advertisement for the exhibition, like, what is Provocations? So we had to include architecture and design in the title for that reason. Anyway, I went to visit Thomas. He had a very tiny studio at that point. There were maybe 5 or 6 people there, including him, in a much smaller space, but in the King's Cross neighborhood of London. And he showed me a lot of his projects. And there was one project that I'll show you in a minute that I was really excited about. And I was working on a Frank Gehry show at the time, so I was looking at this work that was trying to evoke softness or a more organic quality and a sort of tactility that one didn't often see in architecture. And both Frank Gehry and Thomas were looking at different ways of trying to evoke like the folds of drapery in a hard structure. So I really like this one project of Thomas's that he was working on for a Buddhist temple. And as I developed my ideas for the show, I would keep going back to see him when I went to London. And I asked him if I could borrow this model. And there were 2 models. There was a study model and a presentation model. And it was funny because he had never really been in an exhibition before, and he'd certainly never been invited to be in an exhibition overseas. And so he didn't quite know what to make of this request. And the model was pretty fragile, and they didn't have that much work in the studio at that point. So I think every project was like very important to them in terms of showing clients what they were doing. And so he was very reluctant to part with the model. And he said, well, we could make a video of it or something. And I thought, oh, that would be like really boring to show a video of a model, because even a model already is not the building. So if you show a video of a model, then you're like having like yet another layer of mediation between that project and the public. And so I thought, okay, that's, I'll just sort of put that on the back burner and we won't include that in the exhibition. Ultimately, the exhibition ended up going to London, so we were able to talk Thomas into lending to the exhibition because he wouldn't have to worry about shipping things overseas where they would be out of his sight, and he would be worried about how people were going to handle them. And we were also able to include more projects because by then it was maybe a few years, 2 years later, and the studio had more work. So I would just go to his studio, every year or a couple of times a year to see what they were doing. And this is what the studio looks like now. You can see one of the spun chairs in the foreground. and a number of the models that are in the exhibition. But it's a really exciting place because they have all of these shelves that are sort of dividers between the different project areas where people sit. And they have all of these sort of crazy objects in the shelves. Here's another view where you can see people meeting, and the sponge hair again, and some of the models. And so eventually, when I would go to see Thomas, I thought, okay, he has enough work now that I should start sort of prepping him to maybe do an exhibition of his own work, and he'd never done one. So he was sort of like, well, I don't know, and he was nervous because the US was like a sort of whole new stage for him, and he was doing some projects in London, but they were still kind of small. And he designed the bridge at Paddington Station. Behind Paddington, it's a very small bridge that rolls up into an octagonal shape when something has to pass through the channel. And that was the first project of his that was shown, that was ever published in the US in the New York Times Magazine. So he was understandably reticent about doing it. I think he just wasn't ready necessarily. So I had to sort of keep working him over and going to his studio. And I also wanted to make sure that nobody else was going to get there first or, come in at some point and like ask him to do an exhibition, especially in the US. So it was really important to me to make that connection with him. And what happened, so when we did the show in London, the director of MOCA came to the opening, and I took him to Thomas's studio, and he was really enchanted by Thomas's work. And so we both agreed that it would be great to do a show of his work at MOCA. And then a few years, maybe 1 year after that, the director ended up leaving, and then I ended up leaving. And so the director went to the National Sculpture Center in Dallas, and he said, how about if you do the show here for us? And I thought, okay, that would be really interesting. They have a beautiful museum by Renzo Piano. And Thomas, by that time, was ready, so he agreed, and he had made the connection with the director, and that was really an important thing that I hadn't realized, that sort of gave it a lot of gravitas for me to bring the museum director to his studio and to show him that the museum was really serious and committed to doing this exhibition. So that is something that I'll always remember, is to bring like the next person up with me to one of the meetings, so that the designer, if they're sort of reluctant or they're not sure if they're ready, then sort of gets it like this is really an important thing that they should do. So we started working on the exhibition, and I would go to the studio and I would go through all the projects, and over the years I had a couple of different people that worked with me from the studio, and they're all really dedicated to doing this and really interested. So this is the workshop in the studio, and it's a big room, bigger than this room, where they make all of the models and they test out all of their ideas at different scales related to the projects. And if you come to see the exhibition, you'll see the variety in scales in the pieces that I selected for the show. And that is something that I also think is really important, is to try to create a dynamic installation for an architecture show, because I'm sure even as somebody who's really excited about architecture and interested in it and knows how to read architectural drawings, I find a lot of architecture shows very dull, and most people have no idea what they're looking at. They can look at models and they understand that because it's like the shape of the real thing. But in terms of drawings, so many architects want to show all of their drawings, and most people have no clue how to read them or how to look at them or what they're learning from them. So that was a really important thing in this show, was to think about the range of the type of work that he does. And what was interesting is that he doesn't really do drawings, and they do computer models and computer drawings to give to people to construct the projects, but they don't actually do sketches. So the sketches are the physical models that they make in the studio, or he might just put something together. And he's trained as a designer, not as an architect, but he has a lot of architects working for him. So at this point of doing the show, finally, he has 180 people in his studio, from like a 5-person operation back in 2002. And he never worked for anyone else. He started his own studio as soon as he got out of school in 1994. And he said he always felt like he would never be employable by anybody because his ideas are too wacky and quirky and out there. And so he thought it would be best if he just started his own thing and tried to like make his own projects. So this is the project that I saw him working on in the studio, and this is the foam model for this Buddhist temple. And you can see how I would immediately think like this would be a great piece to include in the fashion and architecture exhibition. And then this is the presentation model that they made. And this was a temple for a monastic order in Japan. And the monks haven't been able to raise all the money yet, so they're still hoping that it will be built at some point. And then these are some of the unusual objects in the studio. And one thing I wanted to try to do was to give a sense of all of the activity and the liveliness of the studio and the exhibition installation. So I asked them if we could include some of these objects in the exhibition, because clearly they were there for a reason, that they were looking at them. Some things were there just because they're unusual objects, and other things were there because they were looking at them as, oh, how is this made, or how could I create this effect in a building? Like these two big bunches of rope that are used for like industrial or nautical uses. And so those were sitting around on the shelves. And at first they weren't really they didn't really understand, like, why does she want to include these things? They're weird, they're in our office, they're not our buildings or our furniture or our bridges. But then when I started to be able to flesh out the ideas for the show to them and tell them, okay, well, I want to show this project at Guy's Hospital, and then I keep thinking back to that rope that you have in your studio, and the rope actually is made of all of these individual pieces of fiber that are braided or woven together, the same way that you use this braided metal screen to create this facade at Guy's Hospital. And so then they could start to see the connections, and I think that helped people seeing the show engage in some of the projects, because they saw these things that they could relate to that were from everyday life. And then the other thing with the architecture exhibition is that it's important to tell the story of a project, and whether it's the process of designing the project or the process of building the project, I tried to do that by grouping groups of objects together that related to the same project. So this is 2 photographs of a big installation in Manchester called Bee of the Bang. And at the beginning, Thomas was asked a lot to do public art commissions. And he always says that he likes to incorporate beauty in his work, and that in many cases, especially in the architectural world, beauty is a bad word. And that if you do things that are considered beautiful, then you're considered an artist, and what you do is considered art and not architecture. And he's always been interested, even though he's trained as a designer, in making work at an architectural scale, and that is architecture. And so with the show, we're able to show that trajectory from a lot of these early projects into architecturally scaled work. And one thing that happened just in the same way that the Skin and Bones show got bumped out of the Geffen and into the main building at MOCA was that we were working away on the show. We had a schedule for opening it in the fall of 2012 in Dallas. And all of a sudden, Thomas was invited to design the cauldron for the 2012 Summer Olympics. And the V&A was like, oh, we have to do a show with this person. So they invited him to do a show, and he told us, and he said, I don't really know what to do, but of course he wanted to do it, and it's his hometown, and it was London during the Olympics. So we tried to co-partner with the V&A and co-organize the show. They wanted to do their own show. So we were like, okay, fine, we understand how important it is to him and to the studio. So we put our show on the back burner, and I actually got to be very close colleagues with the curator of the V&A show, and we worked together a lot in talking about ideas about the work. And it worked out really well in the end, because if the show had opened in Dallas in 2012, Cooper Hewitt would not have been through its renovation in time to show the exhibition, and they had already said they were interested. And also Thomas would not have as many architecture projects or built, or for that matter, probably almost any built work to his credit. So it helped me a lot in terms of differentiating this show from the V&A show, but also being able to really show where he's at now and introduce his work to the North American audience. And then this is a roll of zipper that's in the exhibition, and the zipper is interesting because he was interested in how can you use something like zipper. His mother has had a craft shop, and she worked a lot with beads, and he would spend a lot of time helping her with things. And so that's, I think, where he got his interest in making things and also in working with everyday materials. And he created these bags for the Longchamp store. And the one on the right-hand side is like a zipped up bag, and then if you unzip the zipper, which wraps around it, then it expands. And then he ended up designing the shop for Longchamp, and that was his first New York project, and to date, his only New York project. It's in Soho on the corner of Spring and Green, I think. And what's interesting is the whole idea of zipper. I feel like it sort of also reappears in how he designed the stairs, which look almost like a zipper sort of undulating up through the space, because he had to create some way of interest or some interest for people so that they would go up to the second floor, because that shop has no ground floor retail presence. So this is the exhibition at Cooper Hewitt, and Cooper Hewitt is the third venue of the exhibition. So it opened in Dallas eventually in the fall of 2014, and then it went to the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and then it came to Cooper Hewitt. And in each place it had somewhat different character. At Dallas, there were two spaces. There was a space on the main floor that was this beautiful barrel vaulted, natural lit space. And then there was a ground floor gallery. And so we had to keep thinking about what to do with the ground floor gallery. And we made a huge campaign Thomas and I did with the Nasher to try to use all of the space on the main floor and not use anything downstairs, because we kept thinking of it as the basement gallery. And it had no natural light, and it was this kind of like fishbowl space that was a little uninspiring. And so we came up with all of these schemes. Like, we actually designed the exhibition as if it was going to take over the whole building. And the Nasher has a sculpture collection, and they are obligated to the donor of the building and the sculpture collection to show parts of it at all times. So they actually couldn't really, not show it. So we had to use the downstairs gallery. So we came up with this idea of creating this kind of archive in the downstairs gallery. And that's very similar to what you see in one of the rooms at the Cooper Hewitt, where it's a bit more dramatically lit. It's painted a different color, and it has a lot of the earlier projects of the studio. And to go back to the title of Provocations, that comes from the questions that the studio asks itself as it's embarking on the design process. And we included those with each of the projects in the show, so that it's been a really great tool for us, especially with school groups, to ask them that question, the question that the studio might ask themselves, like, how do you design a cauldron for the Olympics that every country can participate in? And so it helps people think about problem solving. And essentially that's what Thomas calls himself, is a problem solver. So in terms of telling the story of a project, for the spun chair, we included the early prototype that they made in the studio, and then we included a spun chair that we cut in half so people could understand the structure of it. And then we also have the real spun chairs that people could use in the ground floor gallery. And here you see how it's displayed with some small 3D printed models that show the evolution in the shape until they reach the final shape of the chair, as well as an earlier metal version in the background, and then a video of somebody spinning. And then we also included this building, or this complex of buildings in Wales at a college, and we wanted to show how they made the skin of the building and how they created the machine in their studio to crumple the steel cladding of the building, and how that shows the ingenuity and that they will actually just make something in the studio. Like, we need to figure out how to do this, and we can't just do it by hand because there are 9 of these buildings and we'll never finish them. So let's make a machine, and the machine ends up being quite a simple structure that they can just feed the sheets of steel through. And then setting up precedents from early projects to later projects with this early pavilion that Thomas did as part of a competition in the 90s, and then the Shanghai Expo, the UK pavilion at Shanghai Expo, which was really the building that put him on the map as somebody interesting to watch, and got him a lot of projects, especially in Asia. And what I've noticed is that he's still much better known in Asia and in the UK than he is in North America. And then just a few more views of the exhibition, the different types of models we created for the show in some cases so that you could see the inside and the outside of a building, and the double rolling bridge that we demonstrate once a day so people can actually see the model operating the same way that the bridge itself would work. And then I actually included a couple of images from the Hammer installation because they show some of the differences, but also some good close-up views of some of the pieces. And then these are other pieces that were in the studio that I talked them into lending. And these are rock candy, giant pieces. They're about this big, like the size of a ham, that are created in a process that's similar to extruding. And extrusion was something that we wanted to show in Thomas's work in the creation of this series of furniture for haunch of venison. And then one of the big challenges at Cooper Hewitt was showing the bus. And this is in the Great Hall at Cooper Hewitt. It's right next to the stairs. And this is the full-scale mock-up of a double-decker London bus, just the back, a slice of the back, so that you can see the rear stairs. And this was literally the only place it would fit inside the museum, because the gallery on the top floor, the ceilings are only 10 feet high, and this was much higher. So we had to figure out early on, like probably the first week that I was there, if this would fit into the space. And then we had to talk to Thomas in the studio about including it, and they weren't really sure. They thought it was sort of weird. It's in between these handrails and the staircase. And finally they agreed, and it actually serves as a really nice signpost for the exhibition. But we had to raise the chandelier that hangs over that area, and that was like a negotiation within the Cooper Hewitt, because of course it was expensive to do that, and we had to do it after hours and have contractors come in with scaffolding and everything. So it was really interesting to sort of go through that process in different locations, and I have never been in that situation where either the exhibition followed me or I followed it to different places, because it was at the Nasher originally, and then when it went to the Hammer, I was no longer working there, but I went back there for the installation. So it was a great experience. So those are my two case studies of the differences between putting on different types of exhibitions and some of the behind-the-scenes negotiations and conversations that are involved, and the sort of things that, you know, most people wouldn't really know about or expect when they're seeing the exhibition on view, and which mostly we don't really want people to know about either when they're looking at the show for the first time. So I'm happy to answer questions, so thank you very much.
So we'll just start with a few questions up here, and then turn it over to the audience and pass around the mic for your questions. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, a little book preview. Can people come up and check it out afterwards? So it was really interesting to hear you talk about those two different types of exhibitions, the thematic show and the monographic show, which seem to be two extremely different animals. And one question I had was, in terms of developing a show with one designer, how are you able to take a position that's reflective and critical when you're working directly with a subject, and perhaps the subject is even designing the show?
Right. I think it's, can you hear me? Is this on? With a one-person show, it's really hard. And I also feel like with a thematic show with multiple designers, I'm taking a position and I'm saying, I think there is a connection between fashion and architecture, and here's where I see it. And so that's sort of, to me, going out on more of a limb than doing a monographic show. For example, when I did the Frank Gehry show in LA, it was right when Disney Concert Hall was opening, so that was like not a risk at all to do a show of Frank Gehry's work. But then one has to think about, like, what's the nature of that show going to be and what's the focus going to be. And so with a one-person show, I think it's often about presenting certain aspects of the work, or with Thomas, it was really introducing his work to the world or to North America. And I think that was the risk in identifying this figure that I thought was worthy of an exhibition at major museums. That would take up like a whole floor, and that the museum would commit a lot of budget to. And so that's the risk. And so it's really hard in an exhibition, I think, when you're working with that person, and they're very conscious of this too, as the negotiation happens about doing the show, and especially in a catalog. I didn't do a separate catalog for Thomas's show because this big Thames and Hudson book came out at the time that the show was going to open originally. Um, so it's hard to I think it's sort of hard and maybe not really appropriate to necessarily, you can't really take a critical stance with that person's work when you're working with them and you're showing their work. So in that case, it's more about how do you want to present their work, and that's where you put your sort of critical voice to work in, saying, I would say, well, I think these projects are worth showing and are really important, and there would be other projects where I would have to spend a lot of time with them saying, well, I don't really think this project is as interesting or as unique as some of the others, and it doesn't necessarily relate to anything else that you're doing. So let's try to leave that off the list. And so that's sort of that kind of negotiation. And I would say when there's a catalog for the show, that's an opportunity to take more of a also critical stance in talking about the person's work and sort of putting the curator's sort of critical spin on the work and evaluating it.
And the Heatherwick materials just seemed so fun to work with. And you were talking about the idea of showing things at different scales in order to make kind of an engaging assortment of material. And that is something that's you're able to do with a studio like Heatherwick. But you were talking about the challenge of curating architectural shows in general, because of it's really usually pretty hard to bring in even elements of the building into the gallery space. So for an architect like a Norman Foster, like how would, if you were curating a show for another kind of architect, what are strategies you might use?
At Harvard, we did a Norman Foster show, and he was receiving an Urban Design Award. And in that case, we were doing a show because he was receiving this award, and it was focused on two projects of his, the Maison Carrée in Nîmes in France, and the Bilbao subway system that he designed. And so I think we showed other projects too. It feels like that was a really long time ago, but I would say, like, personally, if I were choosing to do a show, I probably wouldn't choose to do a show on Norman Foster. But then when you're told that there's going to be a show on Norman Foster because he's winning this award, then we had to start thinking about what would be most interesting to show from the work. And also in that context, because it's really different to show an exhibition in an architecture school gallery where everybody is immersed in architecture and they're thinking about architecture 24/7, as opposed to even Cooper Hewitt, I would say, is different than showing something at MOCA or the Hammer, because Cooper Hewitt is a design museum, so people are already going there, hopefully because they're already interested in design or they want to learn more about design, so they're kind of expecting something related to design. But in an art museum, showing architecture then has its own challenge. So for the Foster show, every time I work on a show, if it's with a living architect, and most of my shows have been, I always wanted to spend as much time as I can either with them or with their studio in the space, understanding how they work, seeing what kinds of things that they make to represent their projects, and then working with them to choose how to represent that project in a way that's going to be meaningful for the audience so they understand the building and how it's made. One show that we did at the GSD was with Raphael Vignoli when he did the Tokyo International Forum building. And that was a really successful installation, I think, because we included this giant model, and that building has this beautiful sort of like ribbed structure, and it's like a big atrium space where they would have expos and conferences and things. And so we suspended this model down the length of the space at the GSD, and then on a table underneath it, we included all of these little study models. And so it was really lively for people, and they could sort of get a sense of like the scale of the Tokyo International Forum, and then also how Vignoli worked, and without sort of hitting people over the head with, first they did this, and then they did this, and then this drawing became a computer model, and then it became a 3D model, and then it became a construction document. And in some cases, you do want to show the construction documents, and it's really interesting for people to see those. And we did some shows at the GSD where we would have like books and books and books of construction documents, because that was really interesting for the students to see for Tokyo International Forum for this one building that they had to make these masses and masses and masses of drawings just to get this thing built.
So it sounds like you've logged in a lot of hours with studio visits, and you also showed a picture of the journal you kept during the Skin and Bones show. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of your own research process, and do you always keep a journal for every show you do, or if you're kind of looking for ideas, and you said the idea of kind of getting there first. So I'm assuming you're kind of constantly tracking people you think are interesting. Like, how do you keep track of those ideas?
A lot of times it's in my head in terms of thinking about people, or I'll make sort of lists, and I have to say the journal makes it look like I'm way more organized than I am. But I had this idea about like, oh, I'm going to clip all these things from Women's Wear Daily and put them in this journal. And I did that for a while, and I would take it with me. And if I went to see an exhibition, like there was this exhibition at the Met that I really liked called Goddess, and there were some beautiful dresses in that, and then I would do sketches in there too. And so it was just a way for me to remember things, and especially if you think that I was starting to look at those things back in 2001 or 2002, we didn't have phones then that we could take photos with. And so now I would say my big tool is I'm writing a lot of notes, but I'm also taking lots of pictures. And when I was thinking about this talk, I thought, it would be really interesting if I thought about it at the beginning of working on a show. Maybe the next show that I do is really like documenting sort of stages of the research and the development as I go, because it's interesting to look back at it. So I had to go to Heatherwick's studio, email them and say, can you send me some pictures of the studio and of the shelves? Because I think it's really interesting to show how interesting that place is and how inspiring it was and how there was so much to look at. And I think that's probably the big part of my process, is just really looking at things. And so whenever I travel anywhere, I always go and I look around at buildings, and I usually ask people about things to see. And when I was doing the blog column for T Magazine blog, it was called Seeing Things. And so it's really all about like being out there and looking at things and reading. And sometimes I might see something on another blog or in a magazine, and then I'll try to follow up on it and see if it's interesting, ask people about it. And I just think on everyday travels, you can sort of come across things that are interesting, that resonate, that stay with you, that could become the germ of an idea later.
So let's take some questions from you all. Lorena's got the mic that she'll hand you. So I think we have one here.
I'm not sure I need a mic, but I just had a question. I love the Heatherwick show, and it was really fun to see so many young people there interacting with the pieces, and it made me think of a question, which is, because educational missions of museums has become so much more of a mandate and kind of a civic connection point, how does the educational mission, especially a place like Cooper Hewitt, shape the way you curate? Because in some ways, like you said, seeing all the materials and seeing the small scales were really made the educational mission so meaningful for someone that is not a very well-known public figure in the United States. But it also seemed like it was such a natural tie-in to possibly educational opportunities, and I didn't know if that was part of your scheme or if that was just a consequence.
Well, it was kind of a coincidence, but because when I did the show initially and chose everything for the exhibition, the only thing that's new for Cooper Hewitt is Pier 55. And I had no idea that I would be coming to New York to work at Cooper Hewitt. So it kind of lent itself really naturally to the education focus of Cooper Hewitt, which is all about design thinking. And we have a program called Design in the Classroom that's a really important program of the museum that's, I think, really unique, that I haven't seen at other museums, where I think it started when Cooper Hewitt was closed for renovation, and the education staff went out into New York, into classrooms, to teach students about design thinking and how they could use the elements of design thinking to solve everyday problems or real life problems. And they created this challenge called Ready, Set, Design, and it's really simple. It's like a paper bag with a bunch of materials in it, like pipe cleaners, tin foil, maybe a bottle cap, maybe some other things, and a challenge card. And then the students are asked to work in teams and to go through the problem-solving process that designers use. And so initially, when I started at Cooper Hewitt, I would talk to them about the exhibition, and the education department was kind of like, oh yeah. They weren't really like they were going to focus on the How Posters Work show, which was they thought was more didactic, or eventually on Pixar, which is in the process lab, and they weren't really that engaged with the Heatherwick show. And then I think it wasn't until we were installing it and they saw all the questions that are there and the nature of the materials in the show that they realized, like, oh, this really lends itself to what we're doing. And so we had a number of programs over the course of the summer and during the show, workshops with students, and we had a design camp for the first year. And 1 week was focused on architecture. And so I gave them a walkthrough of the exhibition, and these were 7 to 12-year-olds. And there was one 10-year-old girl who was so intrigued by the exhibition and the exercise that they did in camp with an architect who was their sort of designer in residence for the week, that she begged her mother to go to Thomas Heatherwick's talk at Cooper Union, and they drove in from New Jersey. And then she wanted her picture taken with him, and her mother emailed us and said, like, every night before she goes to bed, she reads a section of his giant book called Making. So that was really gratifying. And what's interesting, as a curator, you are sort of waiting to see if you're going to get a review of your show, and you hope that it's going to be a good review, but you often don't get comments from the public or from school children that come to see it. And so Cooper Hewitt, because it's so hands-on in terms of education, and the curators are really involved in that, and I work really closely with the education department anyway outside of this show, that it's been really gratifying for me to see how that exhibition really lends itself, and Thomas's way of working and just his sort of persona, to making architecture. I think for me, it's one of the first architecture shows I've done where it's really more accessible to a bigger range of people.
I've seen the exhibition a number of times, and one thing that I really liked about it was the first time I really saw an engagement with the exhibition, especially the bridge, and the excitement of the assistant curator doing the bridge. But the thing that I think is also interesting that I'd love you to share is the guards are also involved. And I've never been to an exhibition at a museum where the guards encourage you to look at an exhibition in a different way, or will gather people around and say, the bridge is going to be happening soon, stay put, come around. So would you talk about that?
Yeah, I think at Cooper Hewitt, a lot of the guards have been there for a really long time, and we have two different sort of, I don't know what you would call them, like groups of guards. One is a contract group, and one is the Smithsonian employed officers, and they're all taking turns in the exhibitions. And so one thing that I did, and I'm not sure if other curators had done it, and I would say not every show at Cooper Hewitt necessarily engages our educational mission. I think Ellen Lupton, a lot of her shows do, because she also is a teacher, and so she's thinking about how to communicate these messages. But some other times I think things can be sort of esoteric and harder for people to understand. In a design museum, it's somewhat easier. But so I did a special tour just with the guards at the beginning, a walkthrough where I talked to them about all of the projects. And I think because of that participatory aspect with the bridge demonstration and the brochure machine, we needed to have them. And also the other thing about Heatherwick is that at the V&A, every single piece in the show was underneath a plexiglass vitrine. And so for our show, I didn't want to do that because these things are artifacts that they make in the studio. They're part of their process. They're not really museum objects. They're, prototypes or iterations of the design. And so we convinced the studio to not cover a lot of things with cases. So we had to make sure that the guards were really engaged in the exhibition. And we had to do that anyway at Cooper Hewitt when we introduced our interactive pen, because the guards often have to explain to people how to use the pen or where to collect the information. And so they became really involved in the show, and it's been really nice to see. Whenever I go to the gallery, and if I go to this closet where the handle for the bridge is, they say, oh, are you going to do a demonstration? Can we tell people that there's going to be a demonstration? And they get really excited about it. And even the guard that has to stand right in the entrance by the video where he's constantly hearing Thomas Heatherwick talking, like all day, every day of the week, they're always really excited to show people and to encourage people to use the brochure machine, which is something that is sort of like the centerpiece of the beginning of the exhibition. It introduces people right away to these ideas where Thomas wants to turn things on their head and create a different way for people to take a brochure in a show, and also how they would make something to actually create a different way of doing something rather than the sort of static act of taking a piece of paper out of a holder on the wall. They want people to like actually operate something to sort of mimic almost the printing process and all of that. So I'm glad that you noticed that about the guards, and I'll be sure to tell them because they'll be really happy to hear that.
I was wondering about about your experience working with fields such as fashion and architecture, which have a lot of non-visual qualities, and you touched on it.
It's okay.
You touched on it briefly at the beginning when you talked about your work at the GSD, and you wrapped the reception desk in columns and how that affected the space, and like consequently the bus and the Cooper Hewitt doesn't fit, so the constraints you have to put it in the Great Hall, but with qualities such as light and dark and even sound. I was just wondering how that affects your work. And I noticed at the Cooper Hewitt, you kind of group things similarly to the cabinet style he has in his office. Things are arranged kind of close together. So I was wondering, maybe in contrast to that, what you do with Norman Foster's work, or how non-visual aspects of architecture and fashion and what you look at affect the way you curate your work.
Like when you say non-visual things, do you mean aspects of the exhibition design, or actual things that are in the show that are, like the labels and the sort of exhibition furniture?
I mean, how you extract non-visual qualities from the fashion you're exhibiting and from the architects and the architects' work you're looking at, and how you try to infuse that, if you do, into the way you curate the shows.
In the fashion and architecture show, that's a really good question, because one thing that I'm not really a big fan of is like tons of exhibition didactics. So I sort of feel like when I'm thinking about something, I want to try to make visual connections for people, or to choose objects that represent an idea more clearly or more emphatically, than having to have a big text that explains, like, oh, you're looking at this dress and it was made this way and it looks like this type of form and that's why it's in the show. So that's sort of how I would think about things, where like that Isabel Toledo dress, that was a pretty clear sort of almost a graphic representation of showing geometry by showing that dress flat on the platform. So you could see that it's a circle. But then on the mannequin, then you can see that it's the same dress, but that it takes a different form, or adjacencies of things. And in some cases, I also try to think about what are you going to see across a room and how are things going to look from different vantage points. So with the Heatherwick show, we wanted to create this kind of island in the center of the space so that everything would be seen in 3 dimensions. Rather, at the Victoria and Albert version of the show, they pushed everything up against the walls, so it was almost like a storage room full of things and objects, but we wanted people to see things more in the round and then also see things from different sides. And it works really well because things that I didn't even think of, like the model for the artist studios in Wales with the crumpled steel facade, that model is only clad on the front of it, and then the back of it you see the structure and you see inside it. And so from the other side of the room you actually get a whole other viewpoint of that project, and you see more how it was made rather than just how it looks completed. And so things like that I think are really important, and things like creating the model for the Zeitz Museum in South Africa, where we sliced it in half. Well, we created it to look like it's sliced in half so you could see the inside and the outside of the building at the same time. So some of those little tricks are really important, and working with architects, they're usually really good at coming up with those. So with Heatherwick, I would say I worked super closely with them in terms of the whole display of the exhibition and how we would show things and what we would show, and they were really open to my ideas. And in fashion and architecture, most people weren't that concerned about how their work was going to be shown in the exhibition, except for Alaya. But most people were pretty trusting about how the pieces would be shown, and they didn't ask us like, what kind of mannequins are you using or anything like that. So it was really interesting that they, like McQueen, they would just say, okay, these are the pieces that we think are really support your thesis for the exhibition and the ideas that you want to investigate. And they didn't ever ask to see the floor plan or where they were going to be on the floor plan, and I don't think any of the designers really asked about that. In some cases, we would show them because we wanted them to understand where it was in relationship to the space itself. Does that answer your question?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question if there are any. Okay.
You were mentioning the pin. How has technology changed the way you work and the way you set up exhibitions since you've started and like to now, since it's changed tremendously?
It's interesting because I think because information is so much more accessible to people, something like Heatherwick Studio, people can then find out much more about that designer or that architect than they could in the past. So it's not just only what's going to be in the show or the catalog, but there's all of this other information available to anybody. In terms of how I work on shows, probably it hasn't changed that much, except that I take a lot of pictures of things. And so I'm constantly looking back through photos and what I have. And so even for this talk, I went back through a lot of the Skin and Bones images that I had to think about, you know, what would be interesting to show in terms of telling the story of putting that exhibition together, rather than in a lecture that I would give just on that show. I might talk more about the themes of the show and the relationships between fashion and architecture, as opposed to the kind of nuts and bolts of doing the exhibition. In terms of the pen, what's really interesting at Cooper Hewitt is I think that we've only had it there for less than a year. It was introduced in March, and we're still seeing its potential and the possibilities, but it's been really great because it enables people to, if you haven't come to Cooper Hewitt and tried it yet, it's a device that looks like a stylus. And for every exhibition, in the Heatherwick show, we have collection maps on the wall. And we also have digital tables that have many more images than one would see in the exhibition, or potentially even different ones than are in the book, that go more into the process of those projects, in many cases the fabrication process. And so those are now available to people to collect. So if they're interested in the double rolling bridge, then they can collect the information about that whole project. So it's the text that I wrote for the show, and then it's also all of the images that we have in the exhibition, as well as the image of the model that's in the exhibition. And for the Pixar exhibition, that is in a smaller space at Cooper Hewitt. It's in the process lab, which is on the main floor, the first floor. And for that exhibition, there are over 600 additional images related to the Pixar films and to their process. And the whole show is about designing story and how did they design a story. And so that really amplifies what we could show in a physical space. So it helps us sort of go beyond the physical parameters of the space itself and really dive deeper into the ideas of these designers and giving people more access to their work.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to take it into the studio over there. So if you want to ask your question to Brooke once we get inside. And looking at the Skin and Bones title, which reminds me that it's time for snacks and drinks. So come and look at the Fashion and Architecture catalog on your way to the studio if you like. But first, please join me in thanking Brooke for a great lecture.
No, but somebody asked me that. I think, I have to say I was really inspired by a colleague's exhibition.